Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on rare Greek tanks and armored cars of the Second World War. During World War II, Greece was actually invaded, first by Italy and Albania, and then later by Germany and Bulgaria, in what was known as the Greco-Italian Wars and the German invasion of Greece, which occurred between the 28th of October 1940 and the 6th of April 1941. Ending on April the 26th, 1941. During the years before World War II, Greece had a pretty tumultuous time period within the politics of Greece. Greece had gone through many different governments and had had many political uprisings, and as a result, the Greek economy wasn't doing so well in the years leading up to World War II. As a result, Greece was run by an authoritarian government led by Leonis Metaxas and his general Alexandros Papagos. And these two were pretty much the heads of the Greek government and the Greek army during the years just before World War II and the 1930s. As a result of this, the Greeks didn't really spend too much money on their ground army. Most of the Greek army was still using leftover equipment from the First World War. It includes rifles and artilleries and some armored fighting vehicles. Now, just before World War II, Greece did actually purchase some armored fighting vehicles in the 1930s, but it was only a small batch of armored fighting vehicles. So let's go over some of the rare vehicles used by the Greek forces during the Second World War. The first armored fighting vehicle used by the Greek forces during the Greco-Italian War were the Hellenic Peerless Vickers armored cars, also known as the Greek Peerless Vickers armored cars, which were a series of heavy armored cars designed in 1923. Now, these were actually upgrades of the British/Irish Vickers armored cars, which were produced during the First World War originally. Now, after the Irish Revolt in the 1920s, Britain had actually refurbished many of their old Peerless armored cars from the First World War and the Irish War of Independence, and later sold them to Greece. And 10 of these vehicles were produced in total. The main armament of these vehicles were either two 8mm or two 6.5mm Hotchkiss machine guns, plus they had small arms like rifles and pistols. The armor thickness was between 3 and 11mm, and the speed of these vehicles were 35 kilometers per hour or 22 miles per hour, and they had a crew of between 2 and 6. Now, only 10 of these vehicles were sent to Greece in 1923, and they were actually used as policing vehicles during the era in which Greece was pretty much stuck in a political quagmire, having various political problems during the 1920s and 30s that would later lead to the rise of Leonis Metaxas, leader of Greece, during the years of the Greco-Italian War and during the German invasion of Greece in 1941. Despite being produced in the 1920s, they were more reminiscent of the armored cars you would see in the early 1900s. For example, the 1900s or the 1910s, or many of the improvised armored cars you would see in the First World War. So these vehicles were actually pretty outdated in terms of their design, but they were some of the first armored fighting vehicles in the Greek army. Now, keep in mind, Greece did have tanks in the First World War that were purchased from France, and they were actually the next vehicles on this list, the Renault FT17. Now, Greece had received Renault FT17 light tanks towards the very end of World War I and the beginning of the Greco-Turkish War in the early 1920s. And these light tanks actually made up the first tanks to serve in the Greek army during the years after World War I. Now, in total, Greece had 11 Renault FT17s still in service during the outbreak of World War II. These were all Renault FT17s armed with the 37mm SA-18 main gun, and these Renault FT17s were deployed on the Albanian front during the Greco-Italian War, and they were actually pretty useful against the Italian army. Keep in mind, during the Italian invasion, the Italians mostly relied on the Caro Veloce L333 series of Tankettes, along with the L335 and L338 series, which were the slightly upgraded versions of the same Tankette model. Now, this small batch of 11 FT17s were actually pretty useful against the Italian forces during the Greco-Italian War phase of the Greek involvement in World War II. but were pretty useless against the German invasion of Greece in April 1941. During that time, the Greeks would face the more advanced German panzer units armed with the newer Panzer III and IV and some of the early Tiger tanks that were serving in the German regular army at the time, and the Greek forces with their FT-17s were simply overrun. But the FT-17 wasn't the only tank to serve in the Greek army. The Renault FT17 was not the only tank to serve in the Greek army during the Second World War. Greece also purchased several Vickers tanks, and the first were the Vickers Armstrong 6-ton tanks, Mark A and B. Now, these were two tanks purchased by Greece in 1932, and they were constructed between 1928 and 1930. There were two separate tanks. The first was a Vickers Mark A armed with two 8mm or 6.5mm Vickers machine guns, and there was a Vickers Armstrong 6-ton Mark B armed with one 47mm Vickers 3-pounder main gun. And these vehicles had a armor thickness of between 19 and 25mm. Their speed was 35 kilometers per hour or 22 miles per hour, and they had a crew of 3. Now, these were the two most powerful tanks in the Greek army, and they were also available mostly for training, but were later used as actual frontline vehicles during the Greco-Italian War. And these vehicles were considered some of the better vehicles to serve in the Greek army. Now, they too were useful against the Italian army, but they were not very useful against the invading German army, who came later on in April 1941. And these were the most powerful tanks in the Greek army. Along with the Vickers 6-ton tank, the Greeks also purchased several Carden Loyd tankettes. The Carden Loyd tankette was a British Tankette series produced in the 1920s and was one of the most mass-produced export tanks for the British Army from Britain to other nations, and Greece purchased at least 3 to 5 of these tankettes. These vehicles were armed with one 6.5 or 8mm Vickers machine guns. This was the Greek version of the Vickers machine guns, and these also served in the Greco-Italian War, but they were originally purchased as training vehicles. Now, it is unknown if these vehicles survived the Greco-Italian War, but they most likely did, and they later went on to serve in the German invasion of Greece in April 1941. Now, the Carden Loyd tankette wasn't that good of a vehicle, but keep in mind, at the time, the Greeks didn't have much money to go around, so the Carden Loyd tankette was better than nothing, and it was an upgrade from the old Renault FT17s. Later on, in 1940, during the Greco-Italian War, Great Britain later sent some of its forces to Greece in order to help the Greeks repel the Italian invasion. But by the time the British got there, the Greeks had already done all of the heavy work, so the British simply supplied the Greeks with some armored fighting vehicles, and this included between 50 and 100 Bren gun carriers. Now, the Bren gun carrier was an infantry support vehicle that was the primary infantry support vehicle used in the British Army. It was pretty much like a tracked machine gun carrier or tankette-like vehicle, and the British would supply between 50 to 100 of these to the Greek forces during the Greco-Italian War. And these were pretty useful vehicles, but ultimately they were pretty useless against the German forces. Aside from the Bren gun carriers, the Greeks had also ordered some Vickers Carden Loyd model 1936, also known as the Dutchmen, and these were originally constructed for the Dutch army in the Netherlands during the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940, but the Netherlands fell too quickly and these tanks were later sold to the Greeks. But unfortunately, again, these tankettes never reached the Greeks in time. By the time these tankettes were completed, the Germans had already started their own invasion. Now, the Renault FT17, the Vickers tanks, and the Bren carriers weren't the only armored fighting vehicles used by the Greeks. The Greeks had also captured some 40 Italian Carro Velas of CV-33, also known as the L333 tankettes from the Italian army during the Greco-Italian War phase of World War II. These vehicles were captured during the early phase of the operation and during the Italian retreat between January and March 1941. And these vehicles were also reused by the Greek army during the German invasion of Greece in 1941. And they were not very useful against the Germans, had much better equipment than the invading Italian army. Along with the CV-33 Tankettes, the Greeks had also captured about 5 to 10 Italian-made Fiat and Saldo M1340 medium tanks. These were very new. These were some of the newest Italian tanks to enter service in 1940. These tanks were captured towards the very end of the Greco-Italian War in 1940, and they were also pressed into service with the Greek forces during the German invasion in 1941. And that basically ends it for Greek tanks of the Second World War. Keep in mind, the Greeks didn't actually produce any of their own armored fighting vehicles. 100% of the Greek armored fighting vehicles were constructed outside of Greece and were purchased from a variety of different countries, from the French, the British, and even captured tanks from the Italians. If I had to choose, my favorite of these tanks would be the two Vickers light tanks that were used by the Greek army, the Mk.E and Mk.B series of the Vickers light tank series. And that's pretty much it. So what do you all think of these Greek vehicles from the Second World War? Please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.